Dillman used the wrong weights. That's the detail that rewrites 4,000 years of assumption about this waterway. Archaeologists working Bahrain, ancient Dillman, the main trading hub of the Persian Gulf, kept finding stone weights that didn't match Mesopotamian standards. They matched Indus Valley standards, the civilization to the east, the customer, not the supplier.
And that matters because it tells you who was actually organizing the trade. If you're a middleman between Sumer and the Indus Valley and you're calibrating your scales to the buyer's system, not the seller's, then the economic gravity isn't pulling westward toward Mesopotamia, it's pulling east toward India.
4,300 years ago, and the pattern has never reversed. Every empire that has tried to control this strait, every navy, every trading company, every superpower, has done so because of what sits on the other side. Not on the Arabian shore, not in Mesopotamia, on the far side, the eastern terminus, the appetite.
Which is exactly what's happening right now, with China importing more oil through Hormuz than any other country on Earth. But we'll get there. The pull eastward, that's the oldest story in this waterway.
So let's start where it starts, the Gulf itself. Because before you can understand why every crisis in modern history keeps converging on this one corridor of water, you have to understand what built it. The Arabian tectonic plate has been grinding northeast into Eurasia for roughly 30 million years. That collision did two things simultaneously. First, it created massive anticline traps, folds in the rock where hydrocarbons accumulated over geological time. That's your oil. That's your natural gas. Both sides of the Gulf, enormous reserves, all produced by the same tectonic event. Second, and this is what nobody mentions, the collision left a piece of ancient oceanic crust called ophiolite, jammed onto the tip of what's now the Musandam Peninsula, Oman's northern tip. That ophiolite is rigid. It doesn't erode the way the surrounding limestone does. So while the rest of the coastline wore back over millions of years, that hard rock held. It kinked the shoreline inward. One geologist described it as a bend in a garden hose.
So the same collision that deposited the oil also built the bottleneck it has to pass through.
The navigable channel through the Strait of Hormuz is roughly 6 miles wide, 2 miles for inbound shipping, 2 miles for outbound, 2 miles of buffer between them. Every tanker passes within 20 to 30 miles of Iranian coastal defenses, not because Iran positioned itself strategically, because of how oceanic crust was emplaced tens of millions of years ago.
The geography is the protagonist here. Iran didn't choose that position. The Earth's crust chose it for them.
And the Gulf was not always a body of water. During the Pleistocene, the last ice age, sea levels dropped far enough that the entire Persian Gulf was dry land, a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed through it and emptied into the Arabian Sea somewhere near what is now the Strait. When the ice melted and water rose, the Gulf filled, but it filled shallow. Average depth 35 to 60 meters, barely navigable for modern supertankers in some areas. That shallowness matters. It means the Gulf has always funneled maritime traffic toward the deeper channels, and the deepest exit channel runs right through Hormuz. There is no alternative sea route. There never has been.
And that was true long before anyone found oil under it. The Sumerians were running trade through this passage in the 3rd millennium BCE.
Akkadian texts, we're talking 2,300 years before Christ, describe a trade highway connecting Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. 3 nodes: Dilmun, which is Bahrain, Magan, which is likely the Omani coast, and Meluha, which is the Indus Valley civilization. Sumerian records describe cargo vessels carrying up to 20 tons making this passage: copper from Magan, carnelian and ivory from Meluha, textiles and grain moving east. And the thing that keeps striking me is the specificity. These aren't mythological references. Sumerian scribes documented tonnage. They recorded cargo manifests. This was administered, systematic, long-distance maritime trade, passing through the strait 4,300 years ago.
And the weights tell you where the power sat. Dilmun is geographically between Sumer and the Indus Valley. It could have adopted either system of measurement. It adopted the Indus system. Think about what that means for who was setting the terms. The Eastern customer was so dominant that the entire Gulf trading network calibrated itself to Indian standards. The middleman bent toward the buyer.
And that orientation, the Gulf as a corridor serving Eastern demand, it persists through every era we can document. It persists when the commodities change. It persists when the empires change. The direction doesn't. After the Indus Valley civilization declined, around 1900 BCE, Gulf trade contracted, but it never disappeared. And when it revived under later empires, the Persians, the Seleucids, the pattern returned. The Gulf existed to connect the resource-rich West to the appetite-rich East.
And nobody understood that better than Alexander.
Alexander the Great reached the Persian Gulf in 324 BCE, near the end of his campaigns. He had already conquered the Achaemenid Empire. He had marched to India and been forced by his own exhausted troops to turn back. And when he arrived at the head of the Gulf, at Babylon, he became fixated on something. He wanted to colonize the entire Gulf seaboard. He sent survey expeditions down both coasts. He ordered the construction of a fleet, and the number that survives in the sources is extraordinary. 1,000 warships.
1,000?
1,000. To control a body of water that most of his generals considered a backwater. But Alexander had been to India. He had seen what was there. He understood that the Gulf was the corridor, and that whoever held the corridor controlled the connection between Mesopotamia and the subcontinent. He planned to settle Greek colonists along the Arabian shore. He planned to dominate the trade routes. He planned, essentially, to turn the Persian Gulf into a Greek lake. And then he died. June 323 BCE, 32 years old, Babylon. The fleet was never built. The colonies were never founded. The Gulf remained what it had been, a passage controlled by no single power, organized around the pull of Eastern demand.
And that's the recurring theme. The strait punishes ambition. Alexander had maybe the most powerful military force on the planet, and the Gulf outlasted him in a single summer.
What makes this remarkable is how long the strait then fades from the Western record. Nearly 1,800 years pass. The Gulf continues to function. Arab, Persian, Indian, and Chinese traders use it continuously through the Middle East. The maritime Silk Road runs through it, but no Western power attempts to seize it until 1507. And when they do, the circumstances are almost absurd. Afonso de Albuquerque was the Portuguese naval commander in the Indian Ocean. Portugal had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1998 and was desperately trying to monopolize the spice trade. Albuquerque understood, and this was genuine strategic vision, that you didn't need to control every ocean. You needed to control the choke points. Hormuz, Malacca, Aden. Lock those three, and you locked the entire Indian Ocean trade system.
3 gates. That was the whole theory. You hold 3 doors, and you hold an ocean.
He arrived at Hormuz Island in 1507 with 6 ships.
6.
6. Against a kingdom that could field 50 or more armed vessels. Hormuz at this point was not some backwater. It was one of the wealthiest trading ports in the world. Its wealth came from a specific commodity that almost nobody associates with the Gulf anymore: horses.
Horses through Hormuz.
Arabian horses, bred on the Arabian Peninsula and in Persia, shipped through Hormuz to the Indian subcontinent. India had an insatiable demand for war horses. The climate and conditions on the subcontinent were brutal on horses. High mortality, poor breeding results, Indian kingdoms needed constant imports, and the primary route ran through Hormuz to Goa and the western Indian coast. The horse trade was the oil trade of its era, essential, high value, continuous, and funneled through the same bottleneck.
The commodity changes, the bottleneck doesn't. Copper in 2300 BCE, horses in 1507, oil now. Same passage, same 6 miles of navigable water.
Albuquerque attacked with 6 ships against the vastly larger fleet, and he won. The accounts describe how he exploited the enemy's formation. The Hormuz vessels clustered together, which meant Portuguese cannon could hit multiple targets with single volleys. He also ran a deception. His soldiers changed armor and appeared on different ships on successive days, making his force look 3 or 4 times its actual size. But the document that survives, and this is the part that reveals his real situation, is his own letter describing the state of his crews. They were starving. They were desperate. This was not a confident imperial power projecting force. This was a gambler who understood that if he didn't seize the choke point, Portugal's entire Indian Ocean strategy collapsed.
So the most consequential seizure of the strait in the pre-modern era was done by a starving commander bluffing with costume changes.
And it worked. Portugal held Hormuz from 1507, then more firmly after 1515 until 1622, over a century. They imposed a system called the cartas, essentially a licensing regime. Any ship passing through the strait needed Portuguese permission, a fee, a document. Without it, your cargo was forfeit and your ship could be sunk.
A toll booth. They turned the strait into a toll booth.
And the toll generated enormous revenue. But it also generated something else, resentment. Every merchant, every kingdom, every trading house that had used those waters freely for centuries now had to pay a European power for the privilege of sailing through their own region. And that pattern repeats. The power that secures passage extracts payment. The resistance breeds resistance. The resistance eventually threatens passage. It happened to Portugal. It will happen to every power that follows.
And the resistance, when it came, arrived through an alliance that would reshape the Gulf for the next 3 centuries. The people who drove Portugal out of Hormuz, that's a story about how the next empire walked in through the same door.
In 1622, Shah Abbas of Persia wanted Hormuz back. He had the army to take the island from the landward side, but lacked the naval power to blockade it from the sea. He needed ships. He needed cannon that could match Portuguese firepower on the water. And he found a willing partner, a company that had been looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. An English trading company operating out of offices in London that had first entered the Gulf just 6 years earlier.
The East India Company.
The East India Company. They arrived in the Gulf in 1616. By 1622, they were helping Persia expel Portugal from the most valuable choke point in the Indian Ocean. In exchange, they got trading rights, a foothold. And what makes this moment so loaded is the reason the East India Company wanted that foothold in the first place. It wasn't about the Gulf. It was never about the Gulf. It was about India.
There it is again. The Eastern Pole. England didn't care about Hormuz for Hormuz's sake. They cared about it because it sat on the route to the market that actually mattered. The Indus Waits, Alexander's unfinished fleet, the horse trade to Goa, and now a London trading company elbowing its way into this same corridor for the same reason, because the appetite to the east demanded it.
And the East India Company's entry in 1622 begins a sequence that will not end for 3.5 centuries. The British presence in the Gulf, which starts as a commercial arrangement with Persia, a side deal to help with the siege, becomes the defining political architecture of the entire region. Treaties, protectorates, borders drawn on maps, states that exist because Britain needed them to exist. But that architecture doesn't emerge overnight. It emerges because of a very specific problem that Britain encounters on the waters between Hormuz and India, a problem that Britain chooses to define in a particular way. And the way they define it, the word they choose, will determine the political map of the Gulf for the next 200 years.
The word they chose was pirates.
Pulse Origins presents Strait of Hormuz, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. This series is for informational and educational purposes only. Historical accounts are sourced from published research, reporting, and public record. Some timelines are condensed for narrative clarity. Nothing in this series constitutes legal, financial, or technical advice. Views expressed are those of the hosts and do not represent the positions of any organization mentioned.
I'm Caden. The Pulse Brief is every weekday, 10 minutes. AI, space, crypto, cybersecurity, what matters most today? Find it wherever you listen.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story told in acts. This season, how AI happened, who really invented the internet, and going back to the moon 53 years later. New chapter every Saturday. Find it wherever you listen.